I think Mark and Sammy have done a wonderful job in showing just how important it is to challenge perceptions and break stereotypes. And I'd like to continue with that theme by taking you on a journey down the Nile. This is a river, not only is it the longest river in the world, but arguably the most important river in the world. It's where human civilization began. It's a river that has attracted explorers, emperors, conquerors, and general travelers for a very, very long time. Alexander the Great built a city at the end of it, and the Emperor Nero, when he wasn't burning down Rome, sent 200 of his finest crack troops to go in search of the source of this great river. And they were defeated in the swamps of southern Sudan. But I think the problem with the Nile, and I think that's something that we've touched on already, is the fact that it also suffers from stereotypes and from being a cliche. I think certainly where I'm from in England, if you say the word Nile, most people will have visions of palm trees swaying against a backdrop of sand dunes, perhaps some pyramids, or sitting on the terrace of the old Cataract Hotel, sipping a gin and tonic whilst watching the feluccas go by. And as nice as that is, it's not the reality for the vast majority of this river. This is the myth that's been perpetuated by Agatha Christie, Death on the Nile. And I think it's this picture that really sums that up. And whilst that's true in places like Aswan, Luxor, it's completely different to the majority of the river. So I actually began in the mountains of Central Africa in Rwanda. And as you can see there, the little red line follows all the way through Rwanda, through Tanzania to Lake Victoria, which is where John Hanning Speke declared to be the source of the Nile back in the 1850s. Well, what he seemed to conveniently have forgotten was the fact that there's an enormous river called the Kagera, which flows from Rwanda for about 200 miles into Lake Victoria. So I thought, if you're going to walk 4,000 miles, you may as well stick an extra couple of hundred on the end to make sure nobody beats you. I followed the river north through Uganda, through South Sudan, into the Sudan, and then finally up to Egypt. And what really attracted me about the Nile, as opposed to anywhere else, was the sheer diversity, was the fact that it isn't just that cliched picture from Agatha Christie. It's a lot more to it than that. And whilst you've got the desert up in the north, as you can see there, it gets very green further south. I'm going to show you some of the landscapes that I walked through. This is Rwanda, the land of 1,000 hills. Some pretty thick jungle, tropical rainforest. I aim to walk between 15 and 20 miles a day on the expedition, but when you're faced with conditions like that, you're lucky if you can do 2 or 3. This is the African dream, isn't it? The picture postcard image of savannas and open plains, and that was certainly a part of it too. This is also the Great Lakes region. You've got Lake Victoria, you've got Lake Kyoga, Lake Albert. This is a very small lake called Lake Basungu that nobody's ever heard of. This is where I spent Christmas Day 2013, and not many turkeys around there, so I had to resort to machete fishing because I'd forgotten my fishing rod. Some pretty big swamps as well. This is the Sud Swamp in South Sudan, one of the biggest swamps in the world, full of crocodiles. And of course, the Sahara Desert. By avoiding the rainy season in South Sudan, which was essential to the success of this journey, I ended up having to walk across the entire Sahara Desert at the height of summer in May and June, where temperatures regularly exceeded 50 degrees. And some pretty big cities. This is Cairo, a city of 20 million people. So I always get asked 2 questions. The first one is always, what's next? As if walking the length of the world's longest river isn't bloody enough. The second one is inevitably why. Why would you want to go and do it? And that's something I'd like to answer. I don't think, though, I could probably do any better than the famous mountaineer George Mallory, who, when harangued by a journalist from New York in the 1920s why he wanted to go and climb Mount Everest, he replied with possibly the 3 most famous words in the history of mountaineering: because it's there. And I think that sums it up. Why not? Why not? But I do sometimes question where my inspiration came from, and I think when I look back long enough, I recall going to a book signing when I was 10 years old by a chap called David Shepherd, who I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of. For those that haven't, a very famous painter, a very capable painter, and one of his favorite topics were elephants. And I remember as a 10-year-old boy looking at this charming old gent and thinking, what a wonderful life he leads. He goes around Africa painting pictures of elephants, and that is what I want to do when I grow up. Until I realized shortly afterwards that I couldn't paint to save my life. So I gave up on that idea and went to my careers advisor, age 10, and said, I want to be an explorer. And he said, don't be stupid, go and work at a bank. You'll earn a lot more money. And he was probably right. But I stuck to my guns, and I read all of the classic texts. I read about Livingstone, I read about Stanley. I read about all these people that went off to Africa to do their journeys. And I thought, what a wonderful, wonderful thing to try to replicate. And I think it was certainly these cliches that probably inspired me, as an outsider, as a foreigner, to come to your continent, to want to find out more. But we don't live in an age of planting flags in the map anymore. We're not here necessarily to explore unknown mountains or rivers. And what I wanted to do was to try and find out what makes modern Africa tick. But more importantly, what makes the individual countries that I was going to pass through tick. So when I figured out how am I going to become an explorer, well, the first step was to join the army. So that's what I did. I joined the British Parachute Regiment and went to Afghanistan and all these places. But what stands out in my mind was one particular mission. I was sent to Burundi to go and train the Burundian army before they went to Somalia. And it was a fascinating experience to work with Burundian soldiers. And we managed to get a weekend off. And I took some of these guys and said, can you show me the source of the Nile? So off I went. I drove through the banana plantations to the top of a mountain. And the top of the mountain was this really naff-looking pyramid built in the Egyptian style with a plaque saying, this is the source of the Nile. And I thought that was easy. It wasn't until I went on Google sometime later that I found that there's actually 6 different countries, all with plaques saying this is the source of the Nile. So as you can see, it's not only a very important river, it's also very complicated. And there's very much a sense of ownership about the Nile. It took me about 2.5 years of preparation before I felt I was ready to go and embark on this expedition. And this is the cliche picture of an explorer doing his preparation. 10 minutes with a map and a glass of whiskey, and that's all you need, surely. Well, actually, there's a bit more to it than that. And, what do you do if a lion chases you? What do you do if a rhino chases you? That'd be a fine thought, wouldn't it? What do you do if you get bitten by a snake? Who is the governor of Bahria province in Egypt? What's the name of the chief of police in Jonglei state in South Sudan? You need to have all of this information to be able to set off and make it a success. Ironically, the one thing that saved my life on at least 3 occasions was always carrying a pack of cigarettes. Now, I don't smoke, but it turns out most gunmen in South Sudan do. And the one thing that breaks the ice, the one thing that stops them putting a bullet in the back of your head when you've been arrested is that simple act of kindness of offering somebody something. One of the biggest challenges wasn't necessarily the physical challenge. It was more the mental. I was walking for 9 months, and sometimes not a lot actually happened. This is in Sudan, from the South Sudanese border up to Khartoum. It is a distance of about 250 miles, and that was it. It was just one straight road. The river was off to the left, about half a mile away, and nice road, but not a lot to see, really. And it doesn't take long before you run out of things to say to your mate, to your guide. So it was quite mentally challenging, the monotony, the boredom, the repetition, forcing yourself to wake up every morning and do a marathon every day. This took me, I think, almost 2 weeks to walk. What you can see there, you see the pylons. There was also lots of telecommunications towers. There's been enormous development in Sudan, which means it's a bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's great because you can go into the nearest shop, you buy a SIM card, and you get your toenail clippers out and chop it down so it fits in your iPhone. And before you know it, you've got Twitter and Facebook and all these great things, which you'd think would be wonderful. But trust me, when it's May and you're on Facebook and all your mates are in Ibiza on holiday having a wonderful time, it's the last thing you want. Wildlife. Of course, I ended up walking through quite a few national parks. And my guide, Boston, took great delight in reminding me on an almost daily basis that the most dangerous place in Africa is between a hippo and the water, which accounted for quite a long time. It was too dangerous to actually swim in the River Nile because of the crocodiles. And Cirillo, my guide, was adamant that there were some pretty big crocodiles. And when I asked him, does this happen all the time? He's like, yeah, my brother got eaten by a crocodile. And as I was apologizing and saying how sorry I was to hear that, he's like, yeah, 11 o'clock this morning, which really shocked me. But it does demonstrate a certain amount of stoicness that, we don't normally encounter. But of course, the most dangerous animal of all is man, and especially ones that put these things out. These grisly-looking bear traps were to be found all over the national parks, I'm afraid to say. And I was fortunate enough to be working with a couple of conservation charities who invited me to go on patrol with some of their rangers and go and actually see for myself some of the work that they were doing. This is a shipping container that was literally full to the rafter with wire snares, with spears, with those bear traps. And it was really sad to see. It only took 2 months for them to fill up an ISO container from one national park, from Murchison Falls. And war. It's the one thing that we do see on the news, unfortunately. And I reached South Sudan. Civil war almost pretty much broke out 2 weeks after I'd begun the journey. And having to walk towards a conflict zone, knowing full well that I was going to be seeing some pretty horrible things, was a real challenge. And it really questions the why do we do this? Is this something I should be doing? So there's all these things, there's all these challenges, things that could go wrong, things that did go wrong. So it comes back to the question of why. Why would you want to face those problems, those hurdles? Well, for me, I think exploration and indeed travel gives you so many things. I'm going to talk through a few of those. Over the course of the millennia, over the past 6,000 years, humankind basically had to adapt to the local conditions. Global climate change, global warming, naturally, of course, changed the face of Africa. The Sahara Desert, which didn't exist in those days, grew and grew and grew and forced the elephants to the south. So what did the people do? If they had nothing left to hunt, they had to go in search of the one thing that they needed more than anything, water. And the only place that they could find that in the whole of North Africa was the River Nile. So what happened? It changed human beings, it changed the history of the world, because as all the human beings in the region were forced together, they had to put down their spears, they had to stop cattle raiding, they had to live together because they were forced to live together in this very narrow valley, the Nile Valley, and as a result, they took up farming. The first villages, the first towns, and ultimately the first civilization was created. So for me, this was very much a journey into the past. It was about seeing how we got here in the first place. But equally importantly, if not more so, it was a journey through the present. I was fortunate enough to travel through places in very interesting times. Has anyone been on a Nile cruise before? A couple of people? Yeah. In 2010, 15 million tourists visited Egypt. There were about 300 cruise ships or boats like this that used to ply the Nile between Cairo, Luxor, and Aswan. When I was there was only one. Tourism completely hit rock bottom because of a couple of revolutions and all of the associated hype that went after that. So you can see just how quickly things can and will change. It's also a journey into the future. It's about seeing what lies ahead. The reason I've chosen this picture is it's the Nyabarongo Dam in Rwanda. They're rediverting the Nyabarongo River, which flows into Lake Victoria. And in doing so, they are building a dam, a hydroelectric dam, that will change the face of Rwanda forever. It will change the face of the Nile forever. So things are changing. Rwanda is a country very much in flux. This is going to provide electricity to 50% of the population. Rwanda in itself is a country where it evokes very strong memories of something that happened 20 years ago, the genocide, where 1 million people were killed, quite often by their neighbors. And to go there 20 years later and see the progress, that is astonishing. Every person that I met that was over the age of 20 was either a victim or a perpetrator. I had to employ, at times, porters who were mass murderers. which is a bizarre thing to think about, but they're getting over it. There's obviously deep scars, but they are looking forward and pushing together as a nation. So it's a journey through the past, the present, and the future. What else is it? Well, for me, I was very lucky to be able to document it. And by doing so, by making a film and by writing a book, all I can hope to do is show people a moment in time, a very brief moment of history in this great continent. But only specifically the 6 countries that I passed through. But it is a real privilege to be able to do that. And I think everybody here is in a very privileged position to be able to show what Africa has to offer by people that want to see it. It's all about inspiration too. I live on a very small island where the weather is crap and people like to escape. So I hope that in a small way I can inspire other people to go on their own adventures and continue the great tradition of travel. So of course, there are lots of things you can gain from travel, and I think people sometimes want to come here for no other reason than for wonderful views too. I don't think there's anything quite as spectacular as an African sunset or the ability to see an African sky, or indeed sleep under unknown pyramids. But ultimately this wasn't a journey for me of putting one foot in front of the other. It wasn't even about breaking Guinness records, and it wasn't even about African sunsets. It was about the people. And I think with any journey, that's what makes it special. Awad, he was one of my Bedouin camel handlers in Sudan. He came with me for 46 days. And at the end of 46 days, what's the one thing you'd probably want after crossing the desert? Well, it was a bit like a mirage appearing as I came across my first village in a very, very long time. And there was a bloke with a motorbike with a fridge strapped to the back of it selling ice cream. I thought, how amazing, just what I wanted. So I bought a round of ice creams. I gave one to Awad, and he sort of looked at it, slightly perplexed, asked me if it was baby food. I said, no, give it a go. He took one lick and then threw it into the gutter, complaining that his tongue was on fire. This was a man who'd never experienced ice before. Now, like all journeys, they come to an end, and I had to say goodbye. And, you know, you get pretty close to somebody when you're walking with them for 46 days. And we got on really well. And I remember, as I was saying goodbye, I had to ask why. You know, he wasn't a rich man, but he had a few camels, and he bought and sold camels and various animals in the market, and he had a pretty happy life. And I said, why? Why did you come with me? You didn't need to. And he was like, well, to be honest, Lev, I'm a very old man. I'm 150 years old. I don't think he was quite that old. But he said, I'm a very old man, and you know what I wanted to do before I died? I wanted to go on a real adventure. And I think that sums it up. I think the concept of adventure is universal, and it transcends race, it transcends culture, it even transcends age. And that's what I learned from this man. So I'm going to leave you the wise words of Dr. Kutangoli, that the one thing that cannot be cured is wanderlust. Thank you very much.